Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey guys, it's Jared. It's episode 2 of my discussion with Colleen Fitzpatrick, the founder of Identifinders International. And if you listen to episode 1, you know that she is just a genius, and especially when it comes to forensics genealogy. So here is episode 2.
And also I know that Verigen, who owns GEDmatch, is working on getting their, processing into the crime labs. So it's not far in the future that, genealogy is going to be more acceptable. It's just not right now.
Right. Yeah, I think when it does, there's a fear out there, and some people have it at least, where they said, you know what, my DNA could show up at a crime scene just by random. Say I was there a week earlier, I wasn't any part of the crime, but because my DNA was there, I'm gonna get convicted for this crime that I didn't commit. And I think you hinted on it, but it's when you have DNA. I mean, unless you actually have a confession and solid one-to-one DNA that's like super strong, that's a CODIS match. But even if you have the forensics genealogy type of a match, it's still just one cog in the wheel. It's just one of the, especially the forensics genealogy is more of just a lead, but even having DNA there at the crime scene doesn't mean an automatic conviction.
Correct. There's a lot of work, like I've solved a lot of old crimes, that's what's been happening in the community. And, it's very difficult because, for example, the Bennett murder, I contributed to that, all right? It was in Aurora in the 80s. All right, I'm going to say I'm a contributed, or even Phoenix Canal. Let's look at that. I came up with the name Miller, that's well known. First case solved using genealogy. They arrested Mr. Brian Patrick Miller. He's going to be on trial hopefully soon. But it's been 7 years now. What have they been doing? Well, really up front, they had to establish he was in the area, that he had the opportunity, that he wasn't out of town when these crimes were committed. All kinds of, they had to, whatever. They had to search his property to see, if the bicycles were there. They had to, suppose they found one of the girls' bicycles there. They get evidence, there's lots and lots. They look at his criminal history and so on. So you just can't pick DNA up and it's been shown, I'm holding this cup, 2 days from now, my DNA is still going to be on that cup. DNA can survive the laundry. They've shown that. So a father's playing with his baby. He goes off to, a business meeting the next day. Something happens to the baby. His DNA is on that jumper, but he wasn't there. They have to, I wasn't there.
Right.
So there's a whole legal system. Now, it's not perfect, but there's a whole legal system to make sure, that the right person is the one that they put on trial.
Right. And I think this is also a great explanation of why some cases take so long, because establishing those links, like I said, even if your DNA is at the crime scene, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get convicted of it, because the detective's job is to, without a shadow of a doubt, establish that the DNA is related to the crime, not just that it happened to be there. And
right.
I really love that as far as our, and I'm sure other justice systems around the world are similar in that they have to have a solid trail of evidence leading up to the murder, so that there's no reasonable doubt that the person actually committed the crime. And DNA is just a tool. It's not the end all be all.
Yeah. Now I want to say there are certain limits on what you can and can't upload to CODIS. You have to have some reasonable idea. It could be the Mr. X's DNA. And that's where, like, a benefit of genealogy, because suppose there was an agency that came to me and they said they found a cigarette butt and it was a female, had smoked a cigarette. And you can develop the profile in your own lab. You can have that. You could do in the lab maybe a few comparisons. I'm not really up to date on that. But uploading it to the convicted offender database, you can't do, unless you're sure. Well, they came up with a cigarette butt with a female profile, and they knew it wasn't the killer. So they put it into genealogy. They did reprocess it for the SNPs, and that was maybe a witness, right? Maybe a witness, and it's okay to take the DNA and do genealogy, find out who that cigarette belonged to, and if that woman was there at the time of the crime, and she may have seen something.
Interesting. Yeah, well, following every lead to exhaustion is what some of these detectives are just so persistent and dogmatic about it. They just go on and on and on, and that's what we pay them to do. And frankly, I think that's a quality that very few people possess, to be able to continue on for decades if they have to solve some of these cases. So before we run out of time, we have to. I think it would be really interesting if you could delve a little more into the Phoenix Canal Murders. Can you describe kind of what happened and how it was eventually solved?
Yeah, I can. There was the Phoenix Canal Murders refer to the homicides of two women in Phoenix, Arizona in 1992 and 1993. In 1992, the woman's name was Angela Brosso. She was a young executive at a company. I think she was from like Wisconsin or Minnesota. She had moved into the area recently, and she lived with her boyfriend. And one evening, she went out riding her bike along the Arizona Canal, and she didn't come back. So her boyfriend issued a missing persons report. And the next day, they found a woman who had been decapitated in a lot. And they deduced it was Angela because she was the only really missing persons report. They put two and two together. Her head was missing. So about 10 days later, they found her head in the canal. It had floated. It had caught on a grating in the canal. And so they retrieved it. And by then, I think they had done DNA, and they knew it was Angela. So Phoenix, of course, went on high alert. I mean, it was, really, a very tense time for the city. After a while, though, nothing happens. People forget. And so about a year later, Melanie Bernas, who was, I think, a high school junior or senior, went riding her bike along the Arizona Canal in the evening, and she never came back. She was found floating in the canal like a day or two later, wearing clothes that didn't belong to her. So this was 92, 93, and this was just about the time CODIS was kind of kicking in. So I think it took, people developed a database, people developed the labs, and it took several years before they linked those two murders with DNA. So the case went cold. And so it happened then in late 2014. I was in Arizona. I was in Phoenix for the International Symposium on Human Identification, ISHI. And as I had been, doing wide DNA comparisons with the genetic genealogy data, let me step aside and say you can do similar comparisons with wide DNA to the genealogy databases. We use YSTRs for that. And the reason is that it's the same marker. So when genealogy got developed, way back in 2000 and people were studying their family names, they borrowed the YSTRs from what the forensic people were doing. So for that reason, I didn't need to mess with DNA. All I could do is say, send me the Y profile, a PDF of the data. I'll put it in my software and I'll run a comparison with what the genealogists have. That's different from SNPs because, SNPs and STRs and crime labs and private labs, it's all different. But early on, you could just plain work with the Y. So I had been going to different agencies for several years, telling them, hey, this has got potential of finding a last name for your killer, because Y DNA goes with the last name. So I went to the conference. I made an appointment with the Phoenix Police Department before I left home, and they were going to be at the conference. They said, sure, come on by. We'll talk what you have in mind. So I went over there in the middle of the conference, had a meeting with them, did a PowerPoint on how you take your Y DNA from a crime scene and how it could match the genealogy and what it could tell you, the ethnicity, it could tell you the last name, maybe a nationality. And leaving, they said, we have a case we've been working on that we might send you. And I said, sure. And then in January, they finally sent me a PDF of the, Y data. And I put it in my software, and I came up with the name Miller. And I didn't think anything about it. I just turned it in. Okay, I had been doing this, for a while. And then I'd say a couple of weeks later, I got an email from, a couple of weeks later, I was in a restaurant with a friend at dinner one night, and one of the detectives called me, at 8 o'clock at night. And I thought, gee, that's kind of weird. I think it's like 9 o'clock in Arizona now. I told my friend, I got to take this. And when I did, he said, you were right. We got him. His name is Miller. And I screamed out in the restaurant, oh my God, they got him. It's like everybody's, what is wrong with her? And I'm like, what did I say? And then, I went home, turned on the, turned on the TV, and, there they were at Mr. Miller's trailer, looking for evidence. And the police department had told me, don't go to the media, don't talk to the media, because this was brand new. Mm-hmm. You gotta understand, this is brand new. Nobody knows the legalities. Don't go to the media. And I had people calling me, they found out who I was, and I really went into, stress over the cell phone ringing and seeing those numbers come up, and I stayed under the radar. Now after a couple of years, they filed Freedom of Information, it kind of loosened up and I was able to talk, but until then, I really didn't say anything. Also, I want to say I had been having hate mail from the genealogy community for what I was doing. And because Big Brother has my DNA, run for the hills, they're going to arrest me any minute. My name is Miller. Oh my God. Not really, as we've discussed. There's a process.
That's so interesting.
And, so for those two reasons, the genealogy community didn't get it. There was a lot of ignorance, not in a bad way, but just uninformedness, and about the legal system that has, I'm very happy to say, dispelled. People are now really discussing real issues and not just, oh my God, they're going to come get me any day. No. But also the police said there's some legalities we don't know about. Please, stay away from the media, which was fine. I didn't want that exposure for the other reason.
Yeah.
And so then they arrested him, and that was it.
Wow. So they got the name from you, and then I'm sure that narrowed down the suspects, and then they were able.
Oh yeah. They had, this is 92 to 2015. I mean, how many years is that? So they had 2,000 suspects, and they narrowed Miller. They only 5 Millers, and you look at those 5 Millers, and there's really one you can't miss. You can't miss. And Mr. Miller, Mr. Brian Patrick Miller, had already been arrested a couple of times. Once as a juvenile, and then another one, he got off on self-defense. So his DNA wasn't in the database. But, everything else, you add and subtract and you watch, and his DNA matched the DNA at the crime scene. They kind of got it from a glass of water, and, the usual stuff. And then,
so you're talking the reference sample?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they got his DNA, they compared it to crime scene, and then they could arrest him. And then they took his DNA at the police station, and that would be the evidence that's used in court.
Right. So off of the crime scene, do you know where they got the evidence?
No, it was he may have sexually assaulted the women. I don't know. Could have been the clothes the other woman was wearing. I they may have told me, but to me it's not important. They
Right.
linked it on DNA. I know that, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, it's the interesting thing is, I mean, as far as the MVAC goes, that's usually where our the majority of our focus is where
Yeah,
we're going to get
I
the.
love MVAC. I
Oh,
love MVAC. That's like a genius invention.
oh well, yeah. I wish my dad was still around. That you could tell him that in person. He would really appreciate that.
Yeah,
But
yeah, he's good.
yeah, but it's finding evidence that's again from the crime scene that's viable evidence, especially after
Yeah,
all that time.
yeah,
Sometimes that's really difficult, and but being able to find a good viable profile and then have a reference sample to compare it to is
yeah,
really important, and that's that one to one that you were talking about. But to
yeah,
me, it's just genius using the forensics genealogy side in order to get that lead and narrow down the suspects. And my understanding is
yeah,
the GSK killer was kind of the same way. They basically had crime scene DNA, but there was thousands of people because he wasn't in the CODIS database, and so they had nobody to compare it
no,
to. But the genealogy side of it was able to narrow down the suspects. Then they could focus. I mean, even 10 suspects is manageable. You can then send
yeah,
send your detectives out there to go get the guy's DNA, even if he doesn't submit
yeah.
it. Like you said, he'll drink something at a restaurant and leave it there.
Or smoke a cigarette.
Right, right. So,
Well, I want to comment. Can I comment on that?
oh, of course.
Because okay, my understanding and Barbara Ray is the one who gets total high marks for that GSK case. My understanding, what I heard, is they got down to maybe 6 people.
Hmm.
It could have been, and I maybe this is close. Okay, might not be exactly right, and that they, the snips can tell you eye color, and they found out that the killer had blue eyes from the snips, and only one had blue eyes, and that was Joe D'Angelo.
Oh, wow.
And so that's
Yeah.
the way. Isn't that cool? And the other kind of cool thing I want to say is that back in about 2012, I went to the Irvine Police Department to talk about the Golden State Killer, and because I guess they were interested in the white DNA. So when I went down there, I talked to the people. There were two people there, and no, 3 people, and I stayed in touch with them over time. And I said, I have this idea, because in 2012 you had GEDmatch, but it was a very small database. You had Ancestry, 23andMe. It was all small. It hadn't really taken off yet. I said, I have an idea. Why don't you go to police departments, fire departments, military installations, and why don't you make it a requirement that they give their DNA to make like a GEDmatch type database for police officers and government workers. And that way, you wouldn't have to mess with GEDmatch and all the genealogists, but you could have like a dedicated database for law enforcement. And it wouldn't matter who was in the database as long as it was a cross section of America, because you're going to find the families anyway. And so I said you could take an unknown profile, process it like through, well, Ancestry, but now we know you can't do that, but process it in a similar way, put it in the database, and do like adoption searches. And this was 2012. And so they thought about it, and Larry Pools said, well, wait a minute. Okay, let me think about it. So subsequently, I went to a couple of police departments, and I said, I have this idea. Could you give your DNA into a database and we could do the genealogy? And the first police department said that they didn't think it would work for political reasons, because a department would use DNA as a bargaining point in contract negotiations with the union. We'll give you DNA, but you have to give us a raise, that type of thing. So he said, probably won't work. It's too much political stuff going on. So I said, okay, can't fight that battle. And I went to another police department, I don't even remember who it was, and I said, hey, why don't you make this database? And he said, well, I don't think it'll work because, there's crooked cops too. And the Golden State Killer was a crooked cop.
Well, the difference is if you're submitting your DNA to be put into the CODIS database, then yeah, I would understand that because again, you're looking for a one-to-one search. But if it's a familiar search, then except for the crooked cops, every cop should be putting their DNA in there because it helps enhance the database, and that enables larger searches.
Yeah, well, let me say you don't put your DNA in any CODIS database.
Right.
You let law enforcement, right? But secondly, it's not familial searching. It's genealogical. Familial searching is in law enforcement. That's a term used for not exact matches, that are near matches or partial matches in the CODIS system. Familial search has nothing to do with genealogy.
Oh, I apologize for that. Yeah, I was conflating the two.
Yeah, I fight that. I fight against that kind of misunderstanding.
Well, that's we'll have to count up how many times you have to correct me on this before we're done.
Okay, no, that's good. That's just once.
No, that's twice. Remember, I screwed up your identifier or finders.
Oh no. Okay, you get a gold star with 2 points taken.
Yeah,
off.
or 2 strikes. So one more and we're done, right? Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.